it's not yet. 3, 2, 1. We are live on Facebook. How's that? Did that work?
That was beautiful.
Thank you.
Welcome to Let's Talk Coronavirus, folks. Week 2 of a 7-week binge. Very exciting for us, isn't it?
Yes.
I am Rachel Bergstrom. I teach biology and in the Health and Society program at Beloit College. I'm here with my co-host this week, Ron.
Ron, so hi, my name is Ron Watson. I also obviously teach here at Beloit College, but I'm in our political science department as well as our health and society program.
And I'm Phil Chen. I'm also at Beloit College, also in political science. I don't teach, other than the research methods class, I don't teach in health and society, but I do have some of our health and society students from research methods.
We still like you.
I know, we love you anyway, Phil.
You can stay on.
Definitely love you anyway.
Okay.
And before we move on to the core of what we're going to talk about today, which is political science, I'd like to say a huge thank you to Whitney Helm, who's our social media manager, who has been with us since the beginning, helping us actually get on Facebook. We literally could not do this without her. So
I mean, seriously, we could not. Whitney.
Thank you, Whitney. We really appreciate you. So with that, let's get started. So as you all know, or maybe you don't know, if this is your first time here in a while, we have incorporated Let's Talk Coronavirus into two bridge courses that we're teaching for incoming first-year students. And so they have a class on Monday, and then they show up here to join in the conversation. And then they have a reflection paper due on Friday. Don't forget, people. And so we're using a lot of questions that have been generated by our class based on some readings that we have done this week. And so this week was all about political science. And we talked about, Phil, do you want to give the 30-second elevator speech of your paper?
Oh yeah. So one of the things we talked about was a paper that I wrote with my co-author, Christina Farhart, who's at Carleton College in Minnesota. And what we did was we looked at the role of gender and benevolent sexism and what role those play in allowing people or encouraging people to practice social distancing, practice public health measures like wearing a mask, vaccine intent, things like that. Finding that women are more likely to engage in these protective behaviors, but that as we look at benevolent sexism, it tends to increase people's desire or willingness to abide by these regulations or these suggestions, especially among Republicans and independents. So that's the short take on it. You can look for it. It'll be, I believe it's going to be an open access article that was just accepted at Politics and Gender, which is a major subfield journal in political science. So it is in the production process right now, and it should be up soon.
Well, that's wonderful. First of all, congratulations on getting your paper accepted. Very exciting.
Congrats, Phil.
Yeah, so our students had a lot of questions that kind of came out of our discussion on Monday. And there's a whole section of questions about political polarization. Mm-hmm. And so I was wondering if the two of you as experts in political science could tell us a little bit about how polarization has gotten what feels like to be really, really, really bad right now. And what is political polarization too? Just kind of give us a little overview of that.
Ron, do you want to start and I'll jump in?
Sure. So when we talk about political polarization, what are we really saying? What we're really saying is that in a system like ours, which has effectively only two major parties, right? That those parties have become so ideologically separated, okay? Which means, in terms of like what they think about the world, what they think in terms of values and about, especially values in the political world, that the sort of middle ground that we might imagine maybe should exist effectively evaporates, right? Such that people effectively divide into these two camps, okay? And you're either in this camp or in that camp. And so when that happens, of course, it becomes very difficult to find places to compromise, right? And we all know that compromise is thought to be extremely important to the democratic process, particularly in an ideologically, if not otherwise, diverse electorate. Okay, so that's basically what political polarization is, right? Has it gotten worse? Yes, it has gotten worse. It's gotten a lot worse. And there are a variety of different reasons that we can talk about. Phil, you want to jump in?
Sure, and I'll give you, again, I'll try to be short here. I've taught an entire class on polarization in America. I'm not going to recite the whole thing. I mean, the short answer is it's a lot of different things that have driven polarization. What we do think is that it began largely at the elite level. That this is not a mass-driven phenomenon. That what we saw is that in the congressional elections, through a number of reasons, through redistricting that reduced competition for electoral seats in Congress. That was a big thing. It allowed members of Congress to campaign for their primary electorate and then essentially win any general election because it's a district drawn for that party. It's about rules that were written starting around the sort of Gingrich, Hastert era in Congress. Some rules that were put into place tended to sort of exacerbate polarization. So there was a lot of sort of elite-driven aspects to this. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, if we look way back in time, if we look back to the 1950s, the American Political Science Association was basically arguing for more polarization. Around then, they come out with this article that says, people can't tell where the parties stand. The parties are essentially the same. They're not making any new arguments. And so people can't be informed about where the parties stand. They just don't know. The parties are basically the same. And so in the 1950s, in fact, 1950, APSA comes out, American Political Science Association comes out with a report that says, we need clearly defined parties with ideological stances. Yeah. And I don't think they really expected where that was going to go in
no, they did not.
Years.
Not the like very, very far apart that we see now. More
right. They were asking for clear policy differences. And they got clear policy differences. They just got a lot of other things that came along with that. Yeah. So we have a lot of things going on, largely elite driven to start, but that's transferred down to the mass level. And so now we have intense partisan disagreement among voters as well. Liliana Mason has a fantastic book called Uncivil Agreement, which talks about how partisanship has become basically an identity. Mm. And so it had become more of a sort of psychological identity preservation issue. And so what we get is a lot of what we call negative partisanship. We've seen huge changes, increases in the numbers that say of people who say would be upset if their child married a person of the other political party, right? Mm-hmm. Far surpassing what we saw in the sort of 50s around, would you be upset if your child married someone of the other race? Mm-hmm. So it's really moved, this idea of politics as identity has really become part of sort of mass behavior in the last 15 years, maybe a little bit longer.
I'd say a little bit longer.
That's what we're seeing that's driving a lot of this now.
Yeah.
So I'd like to tie this then directly to COVID with a few questions from our class. So what our students have noticed, and I have also noticed, I think many of us have noticed, is that there's a really, really partisan divide between how we want to respond to the pandemic. And so we've got a few questions. First of all, like, why do political identities become important or so divisive with responses to national emergencies or pandemics? That's the first thing. And then the second thing is, how do the facts, the fact that masks stop transmission, that social distancing prevents transmission of the virus, how do facts like that get lost in this polarization?
I mean, I think these are great questions. They're basically kind of the same question in the sense that, at least my response to them is the same. is that you're now having to make an assumption about what people accept as fact. And I do mean accept as fact. You say that this is a fact, but we live in an era, and this is part and parcel where this polarization has taken us, and why I love how Phil put it. Right, we sort of, this is really an object lesson in be careful what you wish for, right? Because we ended up with a form of partisan polarization that seems to be driven, of course, it's elite driven, very much elite driven, but that part of what's driving the driving it at the popular level is a variety of different sort of false information and a belief about what constitutes real information, or information that one should heed. Right, and that's part of what partisanship, as any other sort of ideology does, is that it creates a filter, right, of what kind of information you think is acceptable. But when you push things to the level that we have seen them pushed to in terms of polarization, and we see the sort of how can I try to say this? We see how it's being driven by a variety of different information. For example, people will read things on Facebook, right? And they'll say, oh, this is horrible. This is terrible. This is what's causing this. Or they'll say, no, this isn't what's causing this. Everyone is saying that this is a hoax. And I'll tell you, it's like something I read, for example, someone was showing me a comment where this person was just irate. And they were saying, look, this is absolutely being caused by 5G. Do your research. And I laughed. I was like, what do you mean? And so, of course, what constitutes even research for some people, right, has morphed into, how many YouTube videos you could find around this, and not the sort of what we might consider to be, legitimate research. But this is to be expected, right? When we move into this era where information is so freely available and so much of it is being manipulated in a variety of different ways, for both political gain and sometimes just for gadfly gain, right? Just to sort of throw a fly in the ointment. But I would say that my answer to this is basically the same, is that at the end of the day, these both of the questions you asked have to do with the way that this polarization has transferred itself into a sort of what I call, and I think what many people call now, sort of cultural war, right? It's no longer about the facts, though the facts are fluid, in fact, right? When we think about what Kellyanne Conway said, right? That we choose alternative facts, right? We choose to believe in alternative facts. That is the thing that you need to pay attention to, right? Because what she's telling you is that the people that I represent don't accept those facts as facts. And that is actually frightening. And that's how we can get here.
Yeah, and I think, so the other thing I will say is, and this, I cautioned students about this on Monday as well, don't fall into the trap of thinking that the pandemic is somehow a unique political moment in polarization. The political and the polarized response to the pandemic is exactly what we would expect from any major issue in American politics today, where the parties take somewhat divergent sides. So it's dominating the news cycle, but the same dynamic underlying it is at play with many, many, many issues. So it's not really about what's unique about the pandemic. It's about the way that the American political system has been applied to something that has been in the news for the last several months. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the piece there. The other thing about facts is I tend to think about it in sort of a psychological model. We have something called motivated reasoning. Kunda comes out in the 90s with this idea of directional versus accuracy-based motivated reasoning. And her major argument is essentially people tend to be directionally motivated. While we might want people to be motivated to come to the most accurate conclusion, people tend to interpret facts, interpret new information in a way that confirms prior beliefs or confirms prior attitudes. And so what we've seen is people like Lodge and Tabor have applied this to political science. So we have partisan motivated reasoning now, which is we interpret new information in order to reproduce and reify our existing partisan beliefs. So information that says wearing a mask is going to reduce transmission. You see Democratic elites wearing masks talking about this. That information from Democrats is accepted. They say, great, okay, my elites are telling me this, the information is telling me this, I'm going to use that information. I'm going to, highlight that information. I'm going to work it into my belief system. Republicans say, well, Republican elites are saying masks don't help, or we don't need to do masks, or we need to open the economy, or it's about, freedom of choice around whether you wear a mask. And so you hear, I've got, masks reduce transmission, and you say, okay, what information can I use to counter argue this? And we're not really good at counter arguing. We tend to accept any information that fits with our prior beliefs, and we say, okay, well, look at this one piece of information. And so and I want to be clear, it's not a Democrat versus Republican thing. In this case, it's Republicans who tend to be doing this, but the same thing happens to Democrats when they encounter information that counters their prior beliefs. So this is not unique to one political side. It just happens to be that way with the pandemic.
And let me jump in here too, Phil, because I think one of the issues is, and I was mentioning this right before we started, is that the virus and COVID-19, of course, the disease that comes from it, the fatality rate isn't 50%, right? And so that's also part of it, is that if you have created a world around you in which you do not have experience with folks who have contracted and of course dealt with some of the more serious side effects, including fatalities from COVID-19, then you end up thinking, well, you keep saying that it's so deadly. I don't know anyone who is sick, right? And sure enough, some of the information that we've seen that just released over this past week suggests that that if you are African American or Latino, then you have a good chance of knowing someone who has had COVID-19. But if you are a white American in general, right, you have a much reduced chance of knowing someone who has been affected by COVID-19. And when we understand the sort of racial dynamics that underpin that difference, that also helps us to get a better sense of why some people are like, it's a hoax, or it's not that serious, right? Mm-hmm. Even without delving into a better understanding of who it's actually affecting from, and arguing sort of any sort of racist piece of it. I mean, there's no anecdotal evidence for many of these folks mm-hmm. that this is a problem.
Yeah.
And I think that that's an interesting question about the you can't identify with the problem because it's not a part of your experience. And then the information that you're getting from people who you trust through the political system, who you trust to be leaders for you and for the coordinated effort of the community. It's hard to necessarily parse that out and make a lot of sense of it. So we have another question that follows up this little discussion that you had there. And it really is, is our polarization too much for us to get to a point where masks and social distancing can actually help us? I mean, I heard something from the CDC about 4 to 8 weeks of intensive mask wearing, of coordinated mask wearing, of people committed to mask wearing, we can potentially get ourselves under control. And President Trump wore a mask out in public for the first time, right? Mm-hmm. So how do you think about this from a political, because as a biologist, I'm like, yes, wear the masks, people, just wear the masks. It's not that difficult. You're not going to suffocate. So how do you as political scientists approach this? Are masks going to be the thing?
Yeah, I mean, let me just say, I mean, I think it was an extraordinary shift that Trump decided to put the mask on, right? For all of the reasons that Phil already articulated, is that to the extent that this is a sort of elite-driven phenomenon, what that really means is that that people who are in positions of political power or other positions of power in society, that they are sort of setting the pace for everyone under them, and this is absolutely the case for those people who support Donald Trump. But to the extent that he did, this is a sort of massive shift. So what I will say is maybe the possibility opens up for this, right? But I think you also have to keep in mind, at the same time, Donald Trump hasn't really shown, in terms of his leadership, his leadership effectively revolves around his own well-being. And so if he's wearing a mask, he may not be doing that to suggest to his followers to wear a mask. And in fact, this past week, his administration threw the CDC under the bus.
Oh my
right?
gosh.
Under the proverbial bus. So,
oh my gosh.
So, once again, the idea that this might change the type of information that people who support him are able to then sort of translate into, okay, maybe I should wear the mask. I mean, it's up for debate. Phil, what do you think?
So, do I think that the general public is too divided? No, absolutely not. The general public takes their cues from elites. Do I think that we're going to see a major shift from the Trump administration that puts forth a national mask mandate? No. And that's what I think is necessary in order for the public will follow along. If both sides agree and the elites on both sides agree, the vast majority of the public will follow along. So it's not that, so it's wrong to place the blame on the general public. The general public is using cues from partisan elites that they trust. This is what people have been doing for a long, long time in America.
Sure.
The problem is the partisan elites are not in agreement on this. And so I don't think the American public is too far apart. I don't think we can blame this on sort of a sort of an anti-science mass level bias. I think we can blame it on an inconsistent national policy. Mm-hmm. If there is a consistent bipartisan national policy, we aren't talking about this. If there's a consistent national policy that everyone is on board with, we're not having a discussion about polarization because there's no elite driven polarization. We'd be talking about maybe some conspiracy theories, maybe some sort of fringe theories, but we wouldn't have this kind of major discussion and so much sort of disagreement about whether masks should be worn. Yeah. So no, I don't think we as a public are incapable of doing this. The question is whether there is enough leadership coming from the national government to create a bipartisan consensus around this.
And yeah, that's a hard answer because the answer is clearly no at that on that turn at this point. Right?
But there might be.
There might be.
Like we don't know. We maybe we will see a major shift, and the people will likely quickly forget about the prior shift, and until they're reminded in probably a campaign ad in November or whatever. But until then, we'll just follow what the elites are saying.
So we've got two questions on Facebook right now that are related to this. I think there's a question of about social media, like the role of social media, an intersection between social media and politics, and within this conversation about mask wearing, I think we can ask it in a specific way about how is social media contributing to this polarization that's contributing to this gulf between mask wearers and not mask wearers, and can social media kind of come in and help with that too? I mean, to get us all to, if as you've mentioned, Phil, it's not that the public is necessarily anti-science, it's just we're getting the wrong signals.
Mm-hmm. I mean, to start, I see the question, how much can political polarization be blamed on social media? I'm going to say right off, not a ton. Polarization was happening long before social media was a thing, and long before sort of lots of participants joined social media. Polarization was in the works since, like, the levels that we have, like, it was ramping up in the 80s and the 90s. Like, social media makes it far more visible, and it makes it easier to transmit messages. But the polarization and the elite-driven polarization and the trickle down to mass polarization, not really a social media phenomenon. Social media more amplifies in my mind, amplifies the effects of polarization rather than actually causes it. Although you may disagree. So that's my first take on that, is that it's more of a moderator rather than a cause.
Mm-hmm.
Ron, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, you all know I'm no fan of social media, right? And I, and here's the reason why, right? It's precisely what you said at the end, because it amplifies and exacerbates these problems, and it also allows for a variety of different information. And this is one of my big things about false information, right? False or misleading information. And we've seen so much work, so many attempts to try to rein that in over the past 2 years, right? Even before COVID hit. So, I mean, it's clear that this is an actual problem to the extent that most folks operate in a relatively low information environment. When it comes to politics and political beliefs and in fact, even current events, even geography, this is where social media can become extremely problematic, right? Because someone can step in. I mean, I'm reminded of Pizzagate from a few years ago. You all remember that. For those of you who don't,
forgotten about that.
Yeah, no, I'm saying I don't forget when it comes to things like that, because that's scary, right? Like, so for those who don't know, is this idea that, again, this online sort of, social media driven idea that there was some conspiracy, some child trafficking, human trafficking conspiracy happening that involved a pizza shop in DC and Hillary Rodham Clinton. And, this man who was part of those chat groups and reading all that stuff, he took a weapon and went to that pizza place, thinking he was going to liberate the place, right? And it's extraordinary because on the one hand, we almost want to say, wow, man, if that really was the case, good on you, man, go up and bust that ring. But there was nothing that stopped him from at some moment to say, hey, wait a minute, could this actually be real, right? And that's the problem with social media for me, right? Is that for people who absorb and consume a lot of it, there seems to be a clear problem with filtering through what is sensible and what is not for some people, not for everyone, but for some people. And I don't know. I mean, when I think about social media's potential then to help us bridge part of this sort of partisan gap around something like a virus, I'm not really hopeful. I just, I'll call your attention to another thing. 5G. This is all a 5G conspiracy. Like what? When I heard about that, first of all, I found out through social media, like, wait, 5G? You mean the internet thing, 5G? But yeah, there's this whole workup around it, right? So much so that you have people in the UK going and destroying 5G towers when
Can we just explain what that is? Because what the conspiracy is, I think it's fascinating. What is
it? Is. I mean, my understanding is there's this idea that there's something about the 5G technology that is in fact the thing that's making people sick. That it's not a
virus,
right? It's not actually a virus. It's like radio waves, right?
Yeah.
Sort of. I mean, there's also tends to be a sort of an aspect of there's sort of a nebulous, like elite-driven global elites, or yes. Some things we've seen has been like Bill Gates is using 5G. Like we actually have a question on a survey that sort of tests different conceptions of this. But yeah, so it takes different forms, like using 5G to spread the virus, using 5G causes this. Like most conspiracy theories have this idea of sort of a nefarious other. And that's kind of a key component of conspiracy theories, is that there's sort of this other that is sort of pulling the strings, and that this kind of sort of tautological piece of conspiracy theories, in that if you're in the know, you know that somebody is doing this, and if you deny it, you're part of the conspiracy. And so there's this kind of it's this sort of reifying aspect of conspiracy theories that we see not just in politics, but in all conspiracy theories, that like, you know, there tends to be some other driven force, not always, you know, but, you know, even when you think about sort of Area 51, right? Oh, well, the government, right, is trying to hide this or something. So we tend to hear these kind of similar tropes within conspiracy theories.
And so here's for me where why I get so frustrated with these, right, is because on the one hand, you know, people seem to have this tendency to want to believe these fantastical things, right? But yet an open conspiracy like the Tuskegee syphilis trials, no, that's not right. That's not true, right?
Yeah.
You know, and that's another. I mean, that lasted for 40 some years, right? And yet, right there in the open, and so I don't know. I mean, I think that this is where social media is problematic, and I'm seeing you know, a few of the other questions in the chat. You know, someone is asking, you know, is it not correct to have have a different idea politically or socially? Oh, of course there is, right? I mean, of course it's okay to have different ideas politically and socially, right? But here's the problem: when you encounter a situation like this, where do you place your facts? And it has been, as has been famously said, right? Everyone is entitled to their own opinion. You are not entitled to your own facts. And if we exist in a society that has accepted the scientific method and a variety of different expert knowledge as something that we should make decisions upon, then we have to trust that, period. Unless we can present some sort of credible evidence, not one case out of a million, right? We live in a probabilistic universe. All right. So there's always a probability. There's actually no such thing as 100% of the time this will happen. Right. You know, I use the even sort of visceral and kind of, you know, again, you know, showing my Americanness, right, example of getting shot. Right. So you can take 1,000 people and shoot them in the head. This is a very horrible example, but you can do that. Not all of those people will die.
Right. Yeah.
That's just how it goes. Right? Something that, yeah, most of the time, most of those people will die. But there is rarely any case in which we can say 100% of the time, every time there's a plane crash, every single time, everyone will be lost. We often see there's 1 or 2 survivors. So when we think about it in those terms, we have to have some sort of facts that we can then base what we move forward and decisions that we make on. And again, people aren't entitled to their own facts. Yeah, sorry, Rachel.
I'm interrupting you, but I think it's actually important for us to talk a little bit about that scientific process and the idea of facts, because I want to point out that science is a process.
Yes, it is.
It's not a perfected thing, and one of the things that happens with science, and especially in the middle of something like this with COVID, with the discovery. P.S. This is the COVID virus behind me. It's not actually, you know, that color, but it just matches my hair so nicely. But I think it's actually important for us to talk about that scientific process and how that intersects with this psychology of all of this, right? That we learn new things every day, and a good scientist is going to be asking a question, seeking an answer, coming to a conclusion, and then reflecting on it and thinking about collecting more data, collecting more data, seeing the bigger picture, and potentially changing conclusions, right? And so we've seen this actually in the pandemic already, and it's about masks. At the beginning of the pandemic, we in the United States were told not to wear masks, and that's because the question was, is it better or worse for us as a culture that doesn't wear masks to, in the middle of a pandemic, figure out how to wear masks when the cases and the transmission was a little bit lower, right? Because we've really clearly gone. And then there comes a point where the cases of transmissions are getting out of control. And we know that masks have, for example, in other countries, like I think I've read something about Japan has low case count and transmission, in part because culture is part of, mask culture is part of it. I think that that's also the case for some of the containment in China as well. Now we're at a point where we're looking at becoming a culture that wears masks, right? And that's based on an evolving situation. And it's, I think that there's a lot of people in science who aren't willing to do that work, right? To say I was wrong, or I'm updating my information. But I wonder how that process looks different in the political sense. And I mean, my main point of reference right now is the president and his willingness and unwillingness to wear a mask, even in the face of new information. You know.
So look, I mean, and Phil, by all means, feel free to jump in here, right? I mean, there are a couple of things. You know, one, when we think about what's part of this problem, right? Part of the problem, at least in my mind, that has driven this is that many of the solutions, particularly to the economic impact, and I'd say probably especially to the economic impact, involve now bringing in concepts and ideas that have long been associated with sort of the opposite party's politics, right? So left-leaning politics, for example, right? So we're talking about something, oh, we're giving people hundreds of dollars a month, right? Okay, yes. And that is something that maybe more left-leaning political voices have been saying we should do, like, you know, universal basic income and these sorts of things. So now all of a sudden you're asking people to accept some information, to accept now as a normal thing, something that their political elites have told them we must never accept, right? You add that to things like having to wear a mask, not to necessarily protect yourself, but to protect others. So now you're telling folks that you have to do this in order to help others. Well, wait a minute. This is against my individual right? I don't want to help others. I mean, you know, we end up in public health, we have to deal with anti-vaccination a lot, right? And one of the things you hear people say is, as long as I take care of me and my children, I don't really care about, you know, doing anything else. So that's what's important. And that's why I don't vaccinate, because I don't want to harm my children. When you tie those together to these ideas, of course, it becomes difficult for people to accept something different. Sorry, Phil, go ahead.
Well, I just kind of want to jump back to this idea of, you know, is it correct to have different political or social ideas? I think obviously the answer is yes, it's okay to have those ideas. The issue that we've seen recently is that the you know, what we've seen in maybe the last 5 years is this really intense motivated reasoning around fact, right? Or science. We didn't used to see that. We used, you know, so even on something like climate change, right? There was a sort of a universal, for a long time, agreement that climate change was real and was anthropogenic, that it was caused by humans, even among Republicans. But the idea, the reasoning was, well, yes, it might be caused by humans, that, you know, what we're doing might be doing that, but the sort of economic benefits of, you know, of our current transportation system, of our current energy system, outweigh the cost to the climate. That's a cost benefit analysis that is reliant on the same underlying facts. There's, you know, you might disagree with the political conclusion, but it's based on the same evidence, right? To say, well, we know this is happening, but we've decided that the cost to change is too great compared to the cost to staying the same. I don't think you're going to find people who, you know, you'll find people who disagree with that, but you're not going to find people who are upset about the reasoning, or you might. But regardless, the idea is that it's based on the same underlying set of facts. What we've seen recently is this transition away from belief and trust in those experts. We still see predominant 99+% of scientists saying that global warming, climate change is caused by humans. But now you get this reasoning that says, no, we don't have to do anything about it because that is wrong. I think you're going to find a lot more people have a problem with, you know, that you're going to see more sort of people who work in science and academia have a problem with this idea that science is wrong and I know better than people saying, this, I believe the science, I come to a different conclusion about the costs. And so this is I think that to me is the sticking point, right? Like Ron said, you're entitled to your own opinions, you're entitled to even your interpretation of facts, but you're not entitled to different scientific facts. Right. You can say, I don't trust the scientific method, and then, okay, well, then you are entitled to what you want. But if you trust the scientific method, if you trust the peer review process, if you trust the process of academic production of knowledge, then you're going to have to probably then you probably should be accepting the underlying facts. It doesn't mean you can't come to a different political conclusion that relies on a different line of reasoning. That's been happening forever, and that's fine. That's how politics gets moved forward, and how the sort of push and pull of politics happens. But it's a relatively recent phenomenon to see disagreement about the underlying scientific facts.
And for me, it's part of the problem is the arbitrariness of it, right? Because many of the same folks that I've observed who will pass around these theories or talk about these folks will use cell phones to do it. And I'm like, wait a minute. Okay, you can't pick and choose on the science here, man. Like, this is the same method that enabled you to have the thing that you're sitting there typing out this insanity on is part and parcel of the process that you're now saying isn't true, right? This is how we also know about climate change. This is how we also know about the virus. But you know, again, there are a variety of different answers for why we have arrived there. But you know, also the thing to keep in mind too is that good science, that a good scientist is not ever looking to prove their theory. This is a thing that I'm constantly trying to drive into the heads of my students. If you say, I'm trying to prove this, you're already wrong. Just stop there, right? A good scientist is always trying to, the only thing you're trying to prove is that what you have theorized is false. You're trying to falsify what you think, right? And so if you're going out gathering information about, I'm gonna show you this is why 5G is wrong. I mean, this is why 5G is right? And why COVID is a hoax, then you're actually doing it wrong. Then what you need to do is go and find information that falsifies that because you believe that, okay? And so if that becomes, if folks can understand that that's actually how good science is supposed to work and how good research is supposed to work, then you can start to recognize that if you've got 500 people who are from the CDC and from a variety of different hospitals and organizations around the world, not just DC, but from around the world, showing you that there's this virus that's the problem, and you've got 10 people, okay, telling you that it's from 5G, then the cacophony of evidence suggests that something might be wrong with the 5G theory, okay? It doesn't matter that well, I was at a party with someone and they had COVID and, you know, I hugged and kissed them and I didn't get COVID. You know, congratulations, you're part of the probabilistic universe, right? Where not 100% of the time will you get whatever the thing is. I mean, you all, hopefully folks understand, when the Black Plague happened, everybody knows the Black Plague was this horrible thing, killed 70% of the people in Europe, right? But 30% survived, right?
Yes.
That's how it goes,
yep.
Okay? That's how it goes. So this isn't, there is no all or nothing in this. And one of the questions in the chat asked about, you know, like the kernel of truth that's behind certain things. I'm actually not concerned about things like that, right? I'm not concerned about the kernel of truth. I'm concerned about the cacophony of evidence, right? Because that's how we have to make decisions, right? Any one person, and especially when I think about things like racism, right? Any one person can have a negative experience that they can say, wow, I'm going to take that one experience and I'm going to extrapolate to everyone else from that. Okay, that's one of our gifts as human beings. That's why we run from snakes, most of us, right? We don't care if it's a green snake or a black snake or a coral snake or a cobra. We just run from the damn thing, right? But you have to understand that that's something that's hardwired into us as a sort of survival mode, but it's not actually a smart decision making that's happening. It's not smart decision making. Right? Smart decision making is based on information that is reliable and credible, period. And that is not just one case. That is based on multiple cases of people who are deliberately looking for evidence to help us understand what's going on.
But I think, I was going to say, this idea of sort of a kernel of truth, I think, it's less to me a kernel of truth, so much as what is the sort of tipping point moment, right? So we'll take the 5G one. The 5G sort of conspiracy theory comes out largely of this map that maps where 5G is most prevalent in the country and where the coronavirus was, where the highest number of cases of coronavirus were. And it turns out they're almost identical at the start of the pandemic, because 5G is most prevalent in highly populated areas.
Exactly.
And
of course,
coronavirus was spreading in highly populated areas. And so there's no truth to that, but there is a what we would call a spurious correlation, right? Yeah. So there is a tipping point. There does tend to be something in conspiracy theories that make people say, oh, this is why it's this way. But it doesn't have to be truth. There's no truth to 5G, but there is an underlying sort of mechanism that drove it, which was this really, really spurious correlation that's driven largely by population.
Phil, I mean, I'm going to have to disagree with you here, because you and I both know that ice cream trucks caused polio.
Yeah.
You missed last week.
Ice cream trucks caused polio. And this is one of my favorite examples. I mean, and of course, polio is a horrifying disease, right? But there were people who thought, and again, based on the lack of information, lack of understanding about the vector by which this particular pathogen was getting to people and causing, especially to children, and causing this horrific injury to them. There were people who said, "Oh, hold up for a second. When we look at ice cream sales in the summer, we see that maps almost exactly to rises in cases of polio." Okay. Now, what they were seeing, it seems, if you look at on paper, you're like, well, if I don't have a lot of other information, maybe it's something in ice cream. There's newfangled dairy process, right? Instead of naturally getting the milk from the cows, we're now hooking up these machines to them. Maybe there's something, right? There are many ways that you can think about what might be happening there. But now I say that to you and everybody's like, that's stupid. That's not true, right? Because as we look at the information, we can recognize from the very beginning that this is, as Phil has said, a spurious connection, a false connection here, right? Even though it may seem true, that doesn't mean that it is.
All right. So I want to shift. I love that that spurious correlation. And if you're interested in spurious correlations, there's some really wild ones. Just do a Google search. You can find some crazy correlations that seem to explain each other. It's a good thing it helps you recognize this. But I want to shift our discussion just a little bit, because one of the other things that was in Phil's paper was looking at gender. And there's some similar differences, I guess, or some similar a similar divide in the mask wearing associated with gender. And so Phil, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what you found, and we have a few questions from the class about this too.
Yeah, so I mean, the big takeaway that we saw is that women in general are more likely to engage in these protective measures around, say, mask wearing, maintaining social distancing, things like that, than men are. And I should have had this pulled up. I'm going to pull up the article so I can give you exact numbers. As soon as my slow computer decides to do this. But that's sort of our big takeaway. And that is actually very well documented in the literature. That actually, that's a big takeaway from past literature. It was a pretty minor part of our article because it's so in line with so much previous research. Women are also more likely to wash their hands than men. Women are more likely to take public health seriously. This is a long established finding in sort of the realm of like public health prevention, right? I think, Ron, you would agree with that. So that's actually, it's a finding that we recreate, but it's not groundbreaking in any way.
Well, And related to that, though, a few of the questions are about, like, where does that come from? Does it come from biological differences, or does it come from somewhere else? What explains, if it's not biological, what explains it?
Yeah. One of the big things is it's not, it is not biological. We have no evidence that this is biological. What it is almost certainly a function of gender socialization. The way that norms around protection and care and health are gendered feminine in society, and that tends to produce these kinds of patterns. So we have no expectation that this is genetic in some way or this is biological in some way. We do see higher levels of certain personality traits that you might, traits around compassion in women, but even those, like, we know that personality traits are not genetic, that there's a portion of them that's genetic and there's a significant portion that is socially determined, and it's really the interaction of genes and society. So it's not a function of biology. That's the big thing I would say, is that there's just no evidence that this is a biological predisposition for women to be more likely to engage in these kinds of activities. It's almost certainly, again, it's hard to sort of pinpoint, especially you can do it. There's something called twin studies where you can look at the heritability of certain traits and then the influence of sort of shared and unshared social, shared and unshared social environments. You can use these sort of massive twin databases, and in theory you could get at this question, but we don't really need that because we know that there's not sort of a genetic predisposition. We have no reason to expect there's a genetic predisposition towards this kind of behavior. It's almost certainly about the way that gender is socialized in society. So as we sort of reify these gender norms and gender expectations around health and protection, that's where these things reproduce in behavior.
I think one of the interesting parts about this, as a neuroscientist, I agree with you. Just want to make that clear. But I think it's also interesting to think about the brain is constantly responding to environment. And you're right, it's a combination of environment and genetics. The things every day you do anything, it changes your brain slightly. Robin Zabrowski, who's our cognitive scientist at Beloit College, talks about how she thinks it's really funny when people say watching TV changes your brain. And she's like, yes, everything you do changes your brain, right? And so, but the question of, I think the question that's being asked is this because I am genetically female, so therefore I have these traits? No, it's I am genetically female and I have been raised in a society where I, as a female presenting body, am conditioned and expected to do certain things, and I am trying to incorporate myself into that society and be a part of that society. Therefore, these are my behaviors.
Right. I mean, look, if that were really the case, then male surgeons would be in big trouble, right? Because it'd be like, I'm not gonna wash my hands. Like, no, man. So it just shows you can be trained to do these things, and this is effectively about training. Look, we know that there are some minute structural differences, including size, in male and biologically male, biologically female brains.
Hormones matter.
Yeah, because hormones matter. But there's absolutely no evidence that, like, for example, the tendency to wear a mask has anything to do with you having a brain and hormones that mark you as female, right? It's about being trained to pay attention to health. I'm big on the social determinants of health, as you all know. And it's about socialization at the end of the day.
What's our next question, Rachel? Where are we at?
Sorry, I muted.
So there's a lot here. I mean, I saw that we have one here. So someone says, Are there inherent psychological thought process differences between males and females that affect the way that people handle and react to COVID-19? I think we sort of said no with that, but I like this latest question. How do we reestablish societal trust within the health system? And this is a really profound question, because there is a great deal of mistrust. And I would even make the argument that the structure of the American healthcare system being so fragmented, having so many different issues with respect to access, actually exacerbates that mistrust, right? Just the lack of contact. Okay, I only go to a doctor if I am in distress. And this is what maybe many people think, and many don't even go then. Then how can I hope to establish or reestablish trust when I have this one interaction? Sort of going back to what we said before. I had this one interaction and it went badly. And so I'm not going to go back and deal with the system again. Versus if we lived in a different system where I could go to the hospital or go to see a physician or a nurse practitioner more freely, then yeah, okay, I went to this hospital and this doctor treated me poorly, but then I went over here and this nurse practitioner treated me well. So, and I think that this is also a function of how our healthcare system is structured itself and the difficulties there. But part of it has to, I think part of it has to be about us recognizing that we have to act on behalf of one another and inculcating that at every level of our society, right? So I'm wearing the mask not because I'm trying to keep myself from getting COVID-19. I'm wearing the mask so someone I pass at the grocery store, I don't give it to them because I might be an asymptomatic carrier. And if that sort of permeates through how we raise our children, the expectations we have for one another, including the expectations we have for professionals, I think that's how you start to rebuild trust, especially without any other changes. Phil, I mean, I don't know what you and Rachel think, but.
Yeah, so I'm going to quick step back to the question on psychological process differences.
Okay.
When you say between males and females, I think you're right to say no, because that's a question about sex differences, right?
Yeah.
When we talk about men and women, when we're talking about gender and gender expression, yeah, there are psychological processes that differ between men and women, but it's not a function of biology. Right. So you can have psychological process differences that occur because of your environment. And so for men and women, we do see psychological differences in the way they think about things, but it's not driven by biology. It's driven by socialization.
That's exactly it. Yep.
So I'll say that, which is an important difference in the use of the terms males and females and men and women. Men and
women. Absolutely, Phil.
Which we can deal with a different time. As for social trust in the healthcare system, I agree that I think those things would work, Ron. I am perhaps a little more fatalistic. I think back to Robert Putnam's book, right? Yeah. Bowling Alone, this idea of the loss of sort of the American community and community trust. There are lots of issues with Bowling Alone. It's not like the sort of end all be all, but this idea of sort of declining trust or declining faith in neighbors and societal institutions, we see that as a long-term process. So it's not, again, the pandemic is a piece of a much bigger puzzle about societal trust. And so I don't know that there is an easy answer to how we reestablish trust with the healthcare system, because it's not about the healthcare system alone. It's about trust in other members of society. It's a matter of trust in neighbors. Some of it comes from talking to neighbors, forming those relationships, right? This is the essence of contact theory, right? Is that you're more likely to to see sort of similarities and be accepting of people with different identities if you have contact with them under a certain set of criteria. So like there's some of it that's that, but ultimately like it's just about changing the nature of societal trust. And I don't think there's a good empirical answer yet to how we do that. I wish I had some like groundbreaking answer, but I just don't think there is
You did too.
there is something on there.
What did you say?
I wish he did too. I wish
Yeah.
both of you had the answer.
So, love each
I
other
hate
more.
to end on such a pessimistic note, but
Just love each other more.
Love each other more, people. So we do have to end now. And so thank you to all of you who joined on Facebook. Thank you again to our students who provided such interesting and well thought out questions for us to discuss today. We really are enjoying these classes, and we're glad that people outside of classes are able to join us for this part of it. And so, as we do always, what are you looking forward to this week, Ron?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Rachel. I mean, I think one of the things I'm looking forward to is just sitting and watching something with one of my sons, right? He really wants us to get into watching The Legend of Korra. So for those of you who ever watched The Last Airbender, this is like the second part to that, so looking forward to that.
Excellent. And Phil, what about you?
I'm looking forward to essentially 3-day weekend where we get caught up on laundry and like just having time, having some time.
Yeah, I am looking forward to something like that too. We made it through our first day of first year and incoming student registration yesterday. So
good job.
We have, I think, more than 60 people who are registered now. And so that's really, really exciting. And it went off without any major disasters. And so everybody had
always good.
Well, we knew that there were going to be good conversations. I was worried about Zoom and the portal crashing. So that didn't happen. So with that, thank you again, everybody, for joining us. And we'll see you next week, same time and place. Zip Fun and Bob Elder are coming to talk to us about economics. This is their second visit to our show, and we're really, really looking forward to having them join us. So thank you so much.
Take care.